In the lead-up to Saigon's fall on April 30th, 1975, thousands of South Vietnamese made a desperate attempt to leave the country. As early as March 1975, the U.S. government had begun to evacuate its citizens and other foreign nationals, as well as South Vietnamese civilians. In April 1975, the U.S. launched Operation New Life, where some 110,000 South Vietnamese were eventually evacuated, the great majority consisting of government and military officials, Catholics, businessmen, locals employed in U.S. military and civilian facilities, and other Vietnamese who had cooperated or associated with the United States and thus were considered to be potential targets of North Vietnamese reprisal. Also in the final days of the war, the U.S. military implemented Operation Frequent Wind, where the remaining American nationals and U.S. Marines were evacuated by helicopters from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon onto Navy ships waiting offshore. The chaotic evacuation, which moved over 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese, was captured on film showing thousands of frantic South Vietnamese civilians crowding the gates of the U.S. Embassy and helicopters being thrown overboard the packed decks of U.S. carriers to make room for more evacuees. The war had a profound, long-lasting effect on the United States. Americans were bitterly divided by it, and others became disillusioned with the government. War cost, which totaled some $150 billion, put a severe strain on the U.S. economy, leading to budget deficits, a weak dollar, high inflation, and by the 1970s, an economic recession. Also toward the end of the war, American soldiers in Vietnam suffered from low morale, which was compounded by social tensions from the civil rights movement in the United States during the late 1960s. During 1969 to 1972, particularly during the period of troop withdrawal from Vietnam, U.S. soldiers became increasingly unwilling to go to battle, which resulted in the phenomenon known as fragging, where soldiers, often using a fragmentation grenade, killed their officers whom they thought were overly zealous and eager for combat action. Furthermore, soldiers returning to the United States were sometimes met with hostility, mainly because the war had become extremely unpopular and as a result of news coverage of massacres and atrocities committed by American units on Vietnamese civilians. A period of healing and reconciliation eventually occurred, and in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built, a national monument in Washington, D.C. that lists the names of servicemen who were killed or missing in the war. Following the war, in Indochina, turmoil and conflict continued to be widespread. After South Vietnam's collapse, the Viet Cong was installed as the caretaker government. But as Hanoi de facto held full control, on July 2, 1976, North Vietnam annexed South Vietnam, and the unified state was called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Some 1 to 2 million South Vietnamese, largely consisting of former government officials, military officers, businessmen, religious leaders, and other so-called counter-revolutionaries, were sent to re-education camps, which were labor camps where inmates did various menial work ranging from dangerous landmine clearing to less hazardous construction and agricultural work, and lived under dire conditions of starvation diets with a high rate of disease and death. In the years after the war, the Indochina refugee crisis developed, where some 3 million people, consisting mostly of those targeted by government repression, left their homes in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos for permanent resettlement in other countries. In Vietnam, some 1 to 2 million departing refugees used small, decrepit boats to embark on perilous journeys to other Southeast Asian nations. Some 200,000 to 400,000 of these boat people perished at sea, while survivors, who eventually reached Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and other destinations, were sometimes met there with hostility. But with UN support, refugee camps were established in these countries to house and process the refugees. Ultimately, some 2.5 million refugees were resettled, mostly in North America and Europe. The communist revolutions triumphed in Indochina in April 1975 in Vietnam and Cambodia, and in December 1975 in Laos. Because the United States used massive air power in Indochina, North Vietnam, Eastern Laos, and Eastern Cambodia were heavily bombed. U.S. planes dropped nearly 8 million tons of bombs, and Indochina became the most heavily bombed place in history. Some 30% of the 270 million so-called cluster bombs dropped did not explode, and since the end of the war, they continued to pose grave danger to the local population, particularly in the countryside. Unexploded ordnance has killed some 50,000 people in Laos alone, and hundreds more in Indochina are killed or maimed each year. The aerial spraying operations of the U.S. Air Force used several types of herbicides, most commonly Agent Orange, which have had a direct impact on Vietnam. Some 400,000 people were directly killed or maimed, and in the years since, a segment of the population that were exposed to the chemicals have been afflicted by a variety of health problems. Some 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed on 20% of Vietnam's total forested area, which destroyed trees, hastened erosion, and upset the ecological balance, food chain, and other environmental parameters. Following the Vietnam War, Indochina continued to experience severe turmoil. In December 1978, after a period of border battles and cross-border raids, Vietnam launched a full invasion of Cambodia and within 2 weeks overwhelmed the country and overthrew the Pol Pot regime. Then in February 1979, in reprisal for Vietnam's invasion, China launched a large-scale offensive into northern Vietnam, but withdrew its forces after a month of bitter fighting. Instability in Indochina would persist into the 1990s.